You know the vampire. Tall, pale, aristocratic. A castle on a Transylvanian mountain. A long black cape, fangs, a mesmerizing gaze, an accent, an invitation that requires your blood. You've seen this creature in 1,000 films, 100 TV shows, countless novels. It's one of the most recognizable figures in all of Western fiction, and you could describe it in detail without thinking for a single second. Almost everything you just described was invented by one man in 1819, a doctor, Byron's personal physician. He wrote a short story at a house party in Geneva, and what he invented, Lord Ruthven, the aristocratic predator, became the template every vampire since has been copied from. Not from folklore, not from ancient tradition, from a ghost story contest. Because here's what the original vampire actually was: a recently dead peasant, bloated, smelling of decomposition, wearing burial linens, not seducing anyone, not living in a castle, stumbling door to door in his own village, knocking on the houses of his relatives, killing them not with fangs but with proximity. He didn't drink blood to be glamorous. He was the explanation for a plague. The gap between that figure and Count Dracula is a story of how a folk belief about death and disease got alchemized over 2 centuries into one of the most seductive archetypes in popular culture. That transformation is what we're talking about today. Let's start at the beginning. Not with Bram Stoker, not with Gothic literature, with the actual documented folk belief that the word vampire comes from. Legends of vampires have existed for millennia. Cultures such as the Mesopotamians, Hebrews, ancient Greeks and Romans had tales of demonic entities and blood-drinking spirits. Despite the occurrence of vampire-like creatures in these ancient civilizations, the folklore for the entity known today as the vampire originates almost exclusively from early 18th century Central Europe, particularly Transylvania, as verbal traditions of many ethnic groups of the region were recorded and published. The word itself, vampir in Serbian, upir in other Slavic languages, first appears in written records in the early 1700s, when Austrian imperial officials were stationed in Serbia following the Habsburg takeover of the region. These officials began documenting something that the local population took with complete seriousness. The dead were coming back, and they were killing people. Not romantically, not seductively, lethally, in the way that disease is lethal. In European folklore, vampires were most often recently dead peasants, bloated, smelly, ugly revenants who preyed on their own relations and turned up in grave linens, leaking, decomposing bodily fluids. This is the original vampire. Not tall, not pale in any elegant sense. Pale the way corpses are pale, not wearing a cape, wearing burial clothes, and not charming anyone, knocking on doors in the dark, calling the names of his relatives, and leaving death behind him wherever he walked. The primary thing the original Slavic vampire did was spread death through a community when people had no other explanation for terrible things that occurred in the past. Plague, tuberculosis. They would blame it on supernatural forces and vampires. This is the key to understanding the original myth. It was an explanatory framework for epidemic disease. When someone died and their family members began dying one by one, the most logical explanation available was that the dead person was still active, still extracting life from them. The German Nachtseher is a revenant feeding on its burial shroud, linked to plagues. Its feeding thought to weaken relatives. Its role as deathbringer, paralleling vampire fears of epidemic spread. And then there was what the exhumations revealed. When a suspected vampire was dug up, which happened, documented by Austrian officials in multiple cases in the 1720s, the body didn't look the way people expected a properly dead body to look. It appeared bloated. It had blood around the mouth and nose. The flesh was still present, not yet skeletal. Sometimes the corpse seemed to have moved position within the coffin. We now know what causes all of this. Normal decomposition, bloating from gases, blood forced from the lungs and pooling at the mouth, the body shifting within the coffin as tissue breaks down. None of it is supernatural. But in the 1700s, with no understanding of decomposition, this looked like evidence. The body hadn't decayed. It had blood on its lips, and so they drove a stake through it. Not through the heart, in most regional traditions, but through the stomach to release the gases. They decapitated it, burned it, then waited to see if the dying stopped. Sometimes it did, because the disease ran its course, which only confirmed the belief. Jure Grando Alilovich was a villager from Istria who lived in the late 16th and early 17th century. He was described as a strigoi or striken, a local term for a creature resembling a warlock, or what we began calling a vampire during the 18th century. According to legend, Jure terrorized his village for 16 years after his death. Allegedly, he would rise from his grave at night and knock on some villagers' house doors. After a few days, someone from their family would die. Knocking on doors, visiting relatives, causing death through proximity. This is the original mode. No fangs, no blood, or rather blood as evidence of the creature's undead state when exhumed, not blood as a thing it hunted. The mechanism of harm was contact, presence, the terrible contamination of a dead thing still moving among the living. The Slavic vampire wasn't a single unified creature. It was a family of related beings, each regional tradition adding its own specific horror. Avrikolakas is a harmful undead creature in Greek folklore. While similar to Slavic vampires, Avrikolakas eats flesh, particularly livers, rather than drinking blood, bringing it closer to the modern concept of a zombie or ghoul. In Greek folklore, vampirism could occur through being excommunicated, desecrating a religious day, committing a great crime, or dying alone. The Vrikolakas was a creature of religious transgression, dying in a state of sin, outside the church, in a way that left the soul trapped. It knocked on doors and called your name in a familiar voice. When you opened the door, it breathed on you and you died. A plague spreader, an engine of contagion wearing a familiar face. In Romanian and Balkan myth, the strigoi refers to restless spirits or living vampires, reflecting fears of the dead returning to harm a living for familial or societal transgressions. The strigoi came in two forms: the dead reanimated corpse and the strigoi view, a living witch with vampiric properties who hadn't yet died. Vampirism in Romania wasn't only about death. It was a condition some people were born into. The word Nosferatu, popularized by Murnau's 1922 film, has murky etymology. Some scholars trace it to the Greek nosophoros, plague carrier. Plague carrier, that's the root. That's what the original creature was. In Chinese folklore, the jiangshi is hopping undead that drains life energy, qi, rather than blood. Energy, not blood. The fundamental thing wasn't blood drinking. It was a dead creature extracting life from the living. The specific mechanism, blood, flesh, liver, qi, proximity, varied by culture. The horror underneath was universal. The moment that transformed the vampire from a regional Balkan folk belief into a pan-European obsession happened in the 1720s, and it was driven by bureaucrats, not storytellers. In the 1720s, Austrian officials documented vampire cases in Serbia, spreading the myth across Europe. These reports caused panic, leading to exhumations and public stakings. The two most famous cases were those of Arnold Payol and Peter Plogojevich, both documented with clinical detail by Habsburg military officials stationed in Serbia. These weren't folktales, they were government reports, complete with witness testimony, official findings, and descriptions of what the exhumed bodies looked like. When those reports were published, and they were published, circulated, translated, discussed in newspapers across Western Europe, the effect was electric. The Enlightenment was in full swing. The educated classes of Europe were committed to rationalism, to the idea that superstition was being left behind. And here were official government documents, signed by military officers, describing with apparent seriousness the examination of a vampire corpse. The debate that erupted was genuine. Were vampires real? Voltaire wrote about it. The French government commissioned an inquiry. Theologians debated whether the dead could return in bodily form. For roughly 30 years, vampire panic was a serious subject in Western European intellectual life. And in the course of that debate, something shifted. The vampire moved from the peasant village to the drawing room. From a creature everyone who encountered it genuinely feared, to something educated Westerners found fascinating, exotic, and romantic. The infrastructure for Polidori was being built. June 1816, Lake Geneva, the Villa Diodati. Byron, the most famous poet in Europe, had invited a small group, including Percy Shelley, his future wife Mary Godwin, and his 20-year-old personal physician, John William Polidori. It rained for weeks. The summer of 1816 was abnormally cold. The aftermath of Mount Tambora's eruption disrupting weather patterns globally. Trapped indoors, reading German ghost stories, Byron suggested a competition. Each would write a supernatural tale. Out of this evening's entertainment came two works, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Dr. Polidori's The Vampire. Byron abandoned his fragment about a mysterious aristocrat. Polidori, who simultaneously admired and resented Byron, took Byron's fragment and Byron's persona as his raw material. Polidori transformed the vampire from a character in folklore into the form that is recognized today, an aristocratic fiend who preys among high society. Lord Ruthven, the name taken from a character in a novel that had already used it as a thinly veiled satire of Byron, was tall, pale, aristocratic, magnetic, and seductive. He moved through English high society preying on the women he charmed. He was impossible to refuse, impossible to escape, and entirely unlike any creature from Slavic peasant folklore. The modern concept of the arrogant, elegant, predatory male aristocrat who has become the one true vampire was in fact invented by Polidori and probably based on Byron himself. When The Vampire was published in 1819, initially falsely attributed to Byron, it was an immediate sensation. More than 20 19th century authors, playwrights and librettists across Europe adapted Lord Ruthven for the rest of the century. Dumas wrote about him, Gogol was influenced, operas were composed. The peasant revenant was gone. The aristocratic predator had arrived. The 19th century was a period of enormous social anxiety about the aristocracy. The old order was crumbling. The French Revolution had happened. Industrialization was remaking the economy. And the aristocracy, a class that extracted wealth from those beneath it while contributing nothing but bloodline, sat at the center of that anxiety. Polidori's Vampire is a perfect metaphor for the aristocrat as predator. Charming, entitled, taking what he wants from those below him, leaving them drained. The blood drinking isn't gratuitous. It's the point. The vampire is what the aristocracy is, rendered literal. The image of a vampire as an exotic, mysterious aristocrat, charming his victims before feasting on their blood, is very distant from the villagers who came back from the dead in 18th century rural Balkans, but it was far more useful as a cultural mirror. Polidori set the template. Bram Stoker perfected it. Although not the first vampire in English literature, that title belongs to John Polidori's Lord Ruthven. Bram Stoker's Count Dracula is the first character that comes to mind when thinking about vampires. The suave, blood-sucking aristocrat that is Count Dracula has become synonymous with the word vampire itself. choosing to base his vampire on Wallachian Prince Vlad III Dracul, notorious for impaling prisoners. Stoker blurred fact and fiction. Following publication, Transylvania became synonymous with vampires. Dracula was shaped by Victorian anxieties about sexuality, imperialism, and the foreign other. The vampire as a representation of the racial other and the dangerous outsider is the most prominent reading of Dracula. The Count is Eastern European, ancient, sexually threatening. An invasion from the East into the orderly English home. None of that was in the original folklore. In the original, the vampire was your neighbour, your father, your wife. Someone whose death had gone wrong, who was now killing everyone who had loved them. That intimacy. The dead returning to destroy the people who grieved them, was the original horror. Stoker replaced it with the horror of the absolute stranger. Both are horrors. They're just horrors about completely different things. The transformation from plague revenant to seductive aristocrat wasn't just an aesthetic change. It was a loss of something the original myth actually did. The Slavic vampire myth served a real function. It made the experience of epidemic death comprehensible. When tuberculosis moved through a village, which it did constantly in 18th and 19th century Eastern Europe, it took people one by one, often through families, often starting with the youngest and moving to the rest. The pattern of tuberculosis death looks, to an observer without germ theory, exactly like a vampire working through a household. The first to die seems to drain the ones who survive them. The survivors decline, cough blood, pale, waste away. The strigoi was not a relic, but a living explanation, rooted in a relationship with death that no amount of modernity has fully displaced. And as recently as 2004, relatives of a dead man in the Romanian village of Marotanu de Sus exhumed his body, removed his heart, burned it, mixed the ashes with water, and drank it, believing this would stop his vampiric attacks on the living. 3,000 years of medicine separating us from pre-germ theory understanding, and the original folk logic was still present, still being enacted in a living community that had reason to use it. That's not primitive ignorance. That's a belief system doing what belief systems are designed to do, providing a framework for the most unbearable human experiences. Death that follows death, loss that compounds. The terrible feeling in the wake of epidemic that something is still moving among you, still taking people, still not finished. The modern vampire, beautiful, seductive, safely fictional, is a fantasy about power and desire without consequence. From Twilight to Interview with the Vampire, it's become as much wish fulfillment as dread. The thing that was doing real psychological labor for communities facing real death has become, in some ways, costume jewelry. Which isn't a complaint. The aristocratic vampire is a rich archetype that's generated great art for 2 centuries. But it's worth knowing where it came from, not from an ancient tradition of elegant predators. from a bloated corpse in a Serbian grave with blood on its lips and the desperate human need to name what was killing them.
So when you think of vampire,
there's a question worth carrying with you. What is this version afraid of? The original vampire was afraid of disease, of death that wouldn't stay contained, of the dead refusing to leave the living alone. It was a fear of a community without medicine, trying to understand why their children kept dying. Polidori's vampire was afraid of the aristocracy, of a class with unlimited power and no accountability, draining those beneath them and calling it privilege. Stoker's Dracula was afraid of the foreign, of the East, of sexuality that didn't submit to Victorian rules. Every great vampire story since has been afraid of something specific, and the creature transforms to carry that fear, dropping the previous version's anxieties and picking up new ones. That's the thing about the vampire that's actually ancient. Not the fangs, not the blood, not the cape. The underlying mechanism of taking life in a form that's almost seductive, almost intimate, almost voluntary. That was there from the beginning. Everything else was invented later.